I am Don Gibson. At the annual Celebrate Winfield History conference in 2004, I presented this paper recounting Winfield's long association with Mendelssohn's Oratorio, Elijah. The paper was well received, and I've had requests to prepare the material for online streaming. That's what you are seeing today. My voice has become unreliable, thus I've asked my friend John Pollan to be narrator. There are references to John in the paper, as well as references to me. After considering how best to handle first-person and third-person issues, I've decided to have John just read the paper as it was originally prepared. You'll have to imagine that I am the one speaking.
A tradition began with the performance of Mendelssohn's Oratorio, Elijah, on April 15, 1926. H. Hugh Altvater, Dean of Fine Arts at Southwestern College, gathered together singers from the community, 350 of them according to the advanced publicity. The Kansas City Little Symphony was hired to accompany the chorus and 4 soloists. The oratorio marked the conclusion of a 2-day music festival that featured a Wednesday afternoon trio of Winfield musicians, violinist Altvater, cellist Hobart Barber, and pianist Samuel Burkholder. A Kansas City soprano and tenor on Wednesday evening, the Kansas City Little Symphony Thursday afternoon, and Elijah Thursday evening. The title, the Winfield Oratorio Society, appears on that printed program, but whether there was any formal organization as such is unclear. The Winfield Daily Courier reviewer suggested that the chorus could form the basis for a recurring spring music festival. A year later, the Elijah performance was repeated, once again with Altvater conducting. This time the orchestra was made up of the Southwestern College Symphony and other local musicians. Grace Compton, 1 year after her Southwestern graduation, was concert mistress. Preparing the orchestra represented a huge additional task for Altvater. Both the Courier and the Wichita Eagle reviewers suggest how pleased the group was to have been able to pull this off with players from the community. The printed program billed this Elijah as part of Southwestern Artists' Course and noted this to be the 2nd annual rendition of Mendelssohn's Oratorio. The performances continued in 1928 and 1929, with Altvater moving to the role of concert master, turning the baton over to his Southwestern colleague, Harold S. Dyer. In the 5th and 6th years, Hayden Owens, another Southwestern faculty member, conducted with Altvater again as concert master. These performances continued to list Elijah as the last of several offerings in the Southwestern Artists' Course. The Oratorio and Symphony departed from Elijah in 1932, presenting instead as part of the Southwestern Artists' Course, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, a cantata by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and Rossini's Stabat Mater. It's of interest that halfway back in the violin section was a freshman student at Southwestern, Ross O. Williams. The substitution of the Coleridge Taylor and Rossini works proved to be temporary. In 1933, the Southwestern Artists' Course once again culminated with Elijah. Altvater returned to the podium that year. Ross Williams advanced to 2nd chair in the violins. Professor Altvater continued as conductor until he left Southwestern in 1936. Luther Levengood, the new Dean of Fine Arts for the college, conducted in 1937 and 1938. Beginning 1936, the printed programs no longer show Elijah performances as part of the Southwestern Artists course. The performances were sponsored by the Oratorio Society and continued to take place in Stewart Fieldhouse. Although no mention is made in the Courier at the time, the 1938 performance was followed by a hiatus of several years. Later, various reasons have been offered for the gap. The Courier noted in 1947, "It then became crowded out by other interests, and no effort was made to continue it through the war." According to the 1991 program, performances were discontinued because of financial problems and the lack of manpower during World War II. Ross Williams had spent 4 years at Southwestern College as a student. Following graduation in 1936, he was hired to stay on for a year as violin instructor. Williams then went to the University of Michigan, where he earned his Master of Music degree, and returned to Kansas to teach at Dodge City Junior College. 1945, Southwestern appointed this accomplished musician to its music faculty. Ross returned along with his wife Agnes and their 2 little boys, Larry and Bruce. Almost immediately, he talked about doing the oratorio again. Grace Sellers, his Southwestern colleague, who had served as piano accompanist for chorus rehearsals from day one, recalled, "When I first heard Williams say he wanted to revive the Elijah, I thought it was ridiculous. We only had 3 boys in the whole school because of the war, and I just couldn't see how he hoped to do it." But World War II ended before Williams' second academic year, and now there were singers and interest in abundance. When he revived the Elijah tradition in the spring of 1947, he did so with a chorus of 376 members, an orchestra of 54. Ross Williams remained the guiding force for this oratorio for another 40 years. He retired as conductor in 1987, but returned in 1991 for one last performance, sharing the podium with his sons, Larry and Bruce. Elijah is a lengthy work. Mendelssohn's music runs about 2 hours and 10 minutes. Breaks between numbers plus applause and bows. Applause always at the end of the first and second portions. And some years, apparently after most numbers, add more time, as does an intermission. Never was the entire oratorio performed here, as each conductor made cuts, some years more extensively than others. Mendelssohn depicts several dramatic events from the life of Elijah, as told in 1st and 2nd Kings. I have arbitrarily grouped these into 7 episodes or chapters. The first, Elijah's threatening the people with a ruinous drought, was always performed completely in Winfield. In the 2nd chapter, Elijah hides from the people's wrath, first at Cherith's brook, where he is fed by ravens, and then at Zarephath, where he revives a widow's son. This section includes, "For he shall give his angels," scored as a double quartet. It was sung as such the first 2 years, and then not heard again until 1965, when Ross Williams had a St. John's choir sing it alone. Thereafter it was always included, being performed by one of the college choirs. The dramatic high point of the 2nd episode, "What have I to do with thee? Give me thy son. Blessed are the men who fear him," was omitted the first 2 years. The 3rd chapter, consisting of the Baal choruses plus Elijah's bringing fire from the heavens, was always sung in its entirety. "Cast Thy Burden," in this group, is scored for quartet and was sung as such the first 2 years. Thereafter it was used as a special number for either a Southwestern or St. John's choir, or a combined group from both colleges until 1980 and the years following, when Williams reassigned it to the quartet of soloists. The fourth chapter, which concludes part one of the Oratorio, wonderfully describes the end of the drought. Elijah and the multitude pray for rain. A child is sent repeatedly up the hill to look for clouds, and finally, in great excitement, proclaims the approaching storm. The people respond with wild joy. Thanks be to God. This episode was completely omitted the first 2 years, and then was done without the dialogue between Elijah and the child for 7 of the next 8 years. Under William's direction, beginning in 1947, the fourth episode was also complete. Elijah is a lengthy work. Mendelssohn's music runs about 2 hours and 10 minutes. Breaks between numbers plus applause and bows. Applause always at the end of the first and second portions. And some years, apparently after most numbers, add more time, as does an intermission. Never was the entire oratorio performed here, as each conductor made cuts, some years more extensively than others. Mendelssohn depicts several dramatic events from the life of Elijah, as told in 1st and 2nd Kings. I have arbitrarily grouped these into 7 episodes or chapters. The first, Elijah's threatening the people with a ruinous drought, was always performed completely in Winfield. In the 2nd chapter, Elijah hides from the people's wrath, first at Cherith's brook, where he is fed by ravens, and then at Zarephath, where he revives a widow's son. This section includes, "For he shall give his angels," scored as a double quartet. It was sung as such the first 2 years, and then not heard again until 1965, when Ross Williams had a St. John's choir sing it alone. Thereafter it was always included, being performed by one of the college choirs. The dramatic high point of the 2nd episode, "What have I to do with thee? Give me thy son. Blessed are the men who fear him," was omitted the first 2 years. The 3rd chapter, consisting of the Baal choruses plus Elijah's bringing fire from the heavens, was always sung in its entirety. "Cast Thy Burden," in this group, is scored for quartet and was sung as such the first 2 years. Thereafter it was used as a special number for either a Southwestern or St. John's choir, or a combined group from both colleges until 1980 and the years following, when Williams reassigned it to the quartet of soloists. The 4th chapter, which concludes part 1 of the Oratorio, wonderfully describes the end of the drought. Elijah and the multitude pray for rain. A child is sent repeatedly up the hill to look for clouds, and finally, in great excitement, proclaims the approaching storm. The people respond with wild joy. Thanks be to God. This episode was completely omitted the first 2 years, and then was done without the dialogue between Elijah and the child for 7 of the next 8 years. Under Williams' direction, beginning in 1947, the 4th episode was also complete. The first performances took place in Stewart Fieldhouse, on the Southwestern campus. A big, light, resonant room capable of seating more than 3,000, it provided generous space for the performers and for the very large audiences of the early years. For its 1954 performance, the Society used Southwestern's new auditorium, later named Richardson Auditorium. Elijah was given twice that year, on Sunday afternoon and on Monday evening. This auditorium could seat about 600, which was fewer than the anticipated audience. Performances in Richardson always imposed tight quarters on the singers, who were placed on bleacher-type risers on the stage immediately behind the proscenium, and on the orchestra placed either on a jerry-built stage extension or on the auditorium floor. Lighting for the orchestra was poor. However, the auditorium probably was more appealing to the audience members. After 6 years in Richardson, Elijah was moved back to Stewart Fieldhouse and stayed there until 1972, when it was relocated to the St. John's College Gymnasium. This St. John's facility offered easier access and easier parking, as well as much the same benefit of lightness and acoustics as did Stewart. Except for a 1985 return to Stewart, Elijah performances remained at St. John's until that college closed in 1986. The final 6 performances were in Richardson. Mendelssohn does provide a non-essential organ part, and this could be played effectively on the pipe organ in Richardson. One of the St. John's Gymnasium performances used a small positif organ, recently acquired by that college. 2 early performances, 1927 and 1930, list organist Cora Kahn Moorhead playing in Stewart, which has no organ. Possibly one of Southwestern's large St. Reed organs was hauled to the gymnasium for that use. In 1981, John Paulin, a United Methodist minister serving as chaplain at Southwestern College, had visited Mount Carmel with a group of students. They saw the great marble statue of Elijah at the Mufraka Carmelite Monastery there. Paulin dreamed then of bringing Winfield's Elijah to Israel. 3 years later, he saw his dream realized. To mark the 50th performance of Elijah in 1984, a chorus of 110, an orchestra of 35, and 40-plus friends and supporters flew to Israel. There they presented 3 full performances and enjoyed excursions through the region. At Haifa, a sold-out house of 1,100 persons at the elegant Haifa Auditorium warmly received the group. The concert raised $11,000 for the Rothschild University Hospital. The second concert was at the kibbutz Ayala HaShahar in northern Israel, close to the Lebanese border. This was a time of military strife. Paulin recalls, "For that concert we were surrounded by armored personnel, and when the concert began at 9 p.m., because the people who came were primarily farmers, the doors to the concert hall were barricaded shut from the inside." The Society's final performance in Israel was in the beautiful Jerusalem Auditorium. As Paulin had envisioned, the ensemble did indeed perform on the mountainside where much of the original story occurred. It was a damp, drizzly Sunday afternoon when it would have been unwise to expose the string instruments to the elements. No parts of the oratorio lend themselves to accompaniment by wind instruments alone, but "Cast Thy Burden" could be sung without accompaniment, and was so done. Paulin and another minister, John Blythe, from First Baptist Church, read the story of Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal from 1 Kings 18. I remember that I suggested to Ross that the conclusion of the final chorus, "Lord our Creator, How Excellent Thy Name Is, could be sung unaccompanied. We did that, vocalists and instrumentalists singing together. Paulin recalls we had radio and TV coverage, and the Carmelite priest, who was the director of the monastery of Mount Carmel, was introduced to me. With tears streaming down his cheeks, he hugged me and then he said, "I have waited 50 years for someone to bring Mendelssohn's Elijah to the mountain. You are the first group to do this. Thank you." Though a few small scholarship funds were made available, all the participants in the Israel trip, except soloist and conductor, essentially paid their way. Performers paid $1,506, non-performers paid $1,606. Wanderlust Records, a Hollywood, California studio owned by Faye Wyden, a woman with Winfield connections, produced commercial LP platters of the 1960 ensemble. The recording sessions were done in several evenings before that year's performance. The album sold well locally, but sales elsewhere probably did not meet Mrs. Wyden's hopes. She also dreamed of taking the entire Winfield group to perform at the Hollywood Bowl, but that never was realized. In 1960, Leonard Laws, professor of mathematics at Southwestern College, created a sculpture of Elijah from local Silverdale stone and myrtle wood brought from Israel. A photograph of that work appeared on the printed program that year. 3 years later, David A. Amland, an art instructor at Southwestern, created a drawing and wash of Law's sculpture that was used on posters and programs for the 1963 performance. From 1973 to 1983, another unattributed sketch of the sculpture appeared on the program cover. Benton Pugh, an administrator at Southwestern College, designed a pointillist ink drawing of Elijah for the 50th performance in 1984, which was used annually thereafter. The advertising poster for the benefit concert in Haifa, Israel, was a striking work. A copy was graciously given to each participant. The 1933 program, prepared by the Courier's Job print shop, was the first to set the title in Parsons' decorative font with a swash initial capital E. That font was used for the Elijah logo for all the ensuing 52 programs and is now used 70 plus years later for this presentation. Ross Williams retired from conducting Elijah after the 1987 performance, having served 40 years. Jamie Shupner, choral director at Southwestern College, who had sung the title role the 3 previous years, conducted in 1988 and 1989. Larry Newland, a Winfield son who had played viola in the 1950 and 1951 performances, before going on to become associate conductor of the New York Philharmonic, returned in 1990 to conduct the performance. Ross didn't abandon the society. He sang in the tenor section in 1989 and was concert master in 1990. Their performance in 1991 was conducted jointly by Ross Williams and his 2 sons, Larry and Bruce. Each of them, when not at the podium, played either violin or viola, Ross playing both instruments. Jamie Shupner conducted the performance in 1992. Its printed program does not indicate that this was the final planned performance, but it was commonly understood then that it would be. There was a 2009 performance commemorating 25 years since the trip to Israel. It was conducted by Daniel Stevens and performed in one of the high school gymnasiums. though the title Winfield Oratorio Society appears on the very first program in 1926, not until 1928 is any person's name associated with that society. R.M. Hilfinger is noted that year as president. He continued to be listed through 1938. If any records were kept of the early society, they have escaped my search. In 1948, a year after the performances resumed, Herbert C. Hawk is listed as president. Over the next 43 years, that leadership was provided by Wendell Grove, Richard Gibson, Everett Mitchell, C.P. Chris, George Hassard, Bill Soule, Natalina Woods, David Johns, Jim Rosecrans, Obert Kruger, Albert Hodges, John Paulin, Ben Gibson, and Mary E. Blake. Roland Pease, a professional baritone from Evanston, Illinois, sang the Elijah role here 7 times in the first 9 performances. He specialized in that role, and the 1929 Winfield performance was his 421st. Louis Sudler, a Chicago real estate executive who was also a highly trained musician, sang the part of Elijah 10 years. He probably was the most beloved Elijah. His elegance and drama in performance, his graciousness and obvious respect for Winfield made him very popular. Robert Anderson from Emporia sang the title role 11 years, last being heard on the 1984 Israel tour, and thus had the longest run as Elijah. Soprano Ineta Williams-Bebb was the soloist heard most frequently here, performing 14 years. Janet Yenny, alto, was heard 12 years. For 10 performances, the role of the youth was sung by a boy soprano. Terry Sims could do it for 4 years before his voice changed. Aggie Callison sang that role 6 years as a young girl. When no appropriate youth was to be found, a woman would be used. Eleanor Grove stepped up to do that 8 times. Eleanor also sang the incidental soprano lines 24 years. Faye Whitson did the alto lines for 19 years, and Ted Compton sang baritone lines 10 years. I've put together a database of participants in the Elijah, as Winfielders have tended to call the performance and the group. It's from that source that these statistics are gleaned. The list of performers numbers 7,610 different names. The average performer participated 2.1839 times. Ross Williams participated 50 years. Chorus member Faye Whitson sang 46 years. Agnes Williams, 44. Carol Compton, 41. Participants for more than 30 years include Merle O'Neill, 39, Bill Tharp, 37, Annelle O'Neill, 36, Lou Tharp, 36, Earl Dungan, 36, Argenia O'Neill, 36, Marilyn Betham, 35, Max Farr, 35, Don Gibson, 34, Lorraine Dungan, 34, Ward O'Neill, 34, Lester Hogue, 33, Lyle Tharp, 32, Bruce Williams, 32, Patricia Crawford, 32, Al Hodges, 32, Grace Sellers, 31, and Lee Kaufman, 30. The chorus ranged in size from a high of 411 in 1936 to a low of 142 in 1979. Its average was 246 singers. The orchestra ranged from 58 players in 1948 and 1984 to 32 in 1989. Its average was 45 musicians. Earl Dungan was concertmaster for 17 years, Bruce Williams for 16. Some persons' tasks in the production varied, such as playing in the orchestra one year and singing in the chorus another. There were 296 who performed 2 tasks, 36 with 3. Musicians who took on 4 different jobs over the years were Lorraine Dungan, Don Gibson, Woody Hodges, Ross Williams, and Warren Wooldridge. Many families had members sing or play many years. Alphabetically listed families with more than 85 entries include Compton, Dungan, Farr, Gibson, Grove, Hodges, O'Neill, Rush, Tharp, and Williams. Playing second bassoon in 1959 was Meredith Willson. That's the name of the composer of The Music Man, which had opened on Broadway the year before. I don't believe this was that Meredith Willson, but suspect he was a nephew. I played timpani that year and vaguely remember Howard Hallgedal, first bassoon, introducing his Army band friend who was visiting. I've tried to confirm this memory with a dozen other musicians from that era, and with Howard's 2 children, Kristen and Fred, without success. Thus far, I've tried to keep myself out of this paper, but as I come to its conclusion, I want to make some personal observations. 2 men can really be accredited with making the Elijah tradition happen in Winfield: Hugh Altvater and Ross Williams. All the rest of the singers, instrumentalists, conductors, co-conductors, and board members played tiny roles by comparison. I think it's highly significant that both Altvater and Williams were primarily orchestra conductors. I doubt a conductor focused on choral music could have enlisted the necessary ongoing orchestral support that underpins the oratorio. I never met Mr. Altvater. He left here before I was born. His persistence in encouraging the oratorio through its first 12 years is obvious. He conducted, he played violin, he encouraged other musician colleagues to conduct, and then returned to the podium. His hand is visible year after year. After he left Winfield, there are subtle signs that the next 2 performances before the hiatus were not entirely happy events. As I was growing up, I heard the name Hugh Altvater repeatedly. He was highly respected in Winfield. My brother Ben had the statistically improbable experience of following Altvater in 2 separate college communities, Athens, Georgia, and Greensboro, North Carolina. In both cities, as soon as people learned that Ben came from Winfield and Southwestern, faculty members would remember that their former colleague, Hugh Altvater, had previously been in Winfield. They spoke of him in glowing terms. Consider how frequently Altvater must have talked about Winfield for his associates to remember that years and years later. I think Altvater held our town in the same respect that we now hold him in our musical history. Ross Williams gets all the credit for making the tradition span the many years that it did. He was a gentle man, an excellent musician, and an elegant conductor. His quiet manner encouraged people to work for him year after year. Non-musicians may not realize that in a community like Winfield, the conductor of an oratorio also unlocks the door, turns on the lights, sets up the music racks, and arranges the chairs. At the rehearsal's end, he picks up the forgotten copies of music, tidies the music racks and chairs, turns the light off, and locks up. Ross Williams was willing to do this for 40 years. Winfield was greatly blessed by his gracious gift.
For more than 35 years, I celebrated 5 seasons a year. The extra season was Elijah's season. It occurred on those sunny, crisp Sunday afternoons in January, February, and March. My body clock still expects to go to rehearsal on those afternoons.